Hi, dear listeners. This is Kate Riga. I'm here to make a quick pitch that you consider becoming a TPM Prime member. TPM has used the subscriber model for over a decade now, and our loyal members are the only reason we've been able to weather the turbulence of the media landscape and avoid the fate that has befallen so many other independent outlets. For $60 a year, you get no paywall, fewer ads, access to the Hive member forum, a members only newsletter, and more. For $120 a year, you get all of that plus no ads at all. Without our members, there is no podcast, not to mention that I'm out of a job. Thank you so much for listening and supporting us. We couldn't do it without you.
Hi, this is Josh Marshall, and this is the Josh Marshall Podcast with Kate Riga. Today, we've got a couple different topics we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss the unfolding war in Israel, but we're going to kind of deal with that at the beginning because that's a fast-moving story, and we're still in the phase where there's such a chaos about it that it's what we say could be no longer operative. By the time you hear the podcast, and we're also not experts on it, so we're going to deal with that kind of quickly. Then we're going to get into the speaker stuff, which who's an expert on that? But like we're as good as we're as good as you're going to get. So we're going to talk about that, and we're also going to talk about some Supreme Court oral arguments that center on yet another redistricting case. And Kate listened to those oral arguments just earlier today, or sometime today. I'm sort of losing track of things here. So we're going to get into all of that stuff, but we're going to, I'm sure you are seeing everything that has unfolded in Israel and Gaza over the last, I guess it's 4.5 days now. I kind of lose track. I think this U.S. time. I think we woke up to this Saturday morning. Like I said, I've been sort of keeping up on it, living through it over the last 4+ days. So I think that's right. And there's just so many, there's so many different moving parts of this. I'm sure you've seen the various pictures and accounts of basically just sort of like a mass murder of about 1,000 people, almost all of which were in a series of kibbutzim, which are collective farms. Basically, they've changed over the course of the last century, but that's basically the idea. And some villages and towns that are in the south of Israel and relatively close to the border with the Gaza Strip. So what happened here is you had it seems like about 1,000 Hamas fighters that in a pretty well executed operation managed to breach the series of fences and sort of electronic surveillance that they have along the border with Gaza. And, once they got through there, they caught the Israelis really totally off guard. So this is moving into civilian areas. So, right, there's not like another line of defense there that is, waiting for what is basically an irregular army coming through. And they went into these towns and villages and just started killing people indiscriminately. Again, you've seen this stuff here. One thing, I'm not going to be able to do any justice to the larger story. I'll just mention a few observations that you may find significant or interesting. One thing that I think is worth noting, even though it's only a small part of this story, that is that the Hamas army, some people get a charge about identifying these people as terrorists. I don't, to me, calling them fighters versus terrorists is not, that doesn't have a lot of significance to me. I'm not trying to signal a moral argument about labels. You may differ. That's fine. Uh, One of the things they were able to do here was have a very well planned hitting key points in the manning and surveillance of this border. And one of the things they were able to do was to use drones to hit some key points. Hit a tank here, hit an observation tower here, hit a border crossing here. And it is worth noting that they seem to have been learning some of the lessons that we've seen out of Ukraine. That a much weaker force, by using technologies that now you can pick this stuff up, some of this stuff up at Best Buy, right? Can get a jump on a much more powerful military. And some of that is what we saw certainly in the early days of the Ukraine war. And I make this point because this is something that the U.S. is going to have to take cognizance of, because we are the ultimate big, heavy military power that, by definition, is almost always, to the extent we're going to come into conflict, it's almost never going to be a peer military. It can be close. If we got into a conflict with China, that's another country with a big military. But even China, we have more stuff, more technology than them, more bombs. But weaker countries can get a jump on us using the latest technology, and not just the technology that only governments can come up with. Some of which technology is even civilian technology. So something to have in the back of your mind. Another thing, as this has unfolded, and for what it's worth, the death toll now seems to be about 1,200 Israelis, almost all of whom were killed almost before most of us knew this was even happening, and probably 900 Gazans who have died in the course of the retaliation for this, and large numbers of wounded on both sides. And one of the things that is hanging in the background with this is that uh, you know Hamas they have rockets, they have RPGs, they have machine guns, but basically this is not a serious army in the sense of having tanks and planes and all that kind of stuff. To the north of Israel is still not a pure army, but a much more powerful force, and that's Hezbollah, that is just across the border in Lebanon and basically controls the part of Lebanon that is immediately adjacent to Israel. And they are much closer with Iran. They are co-religionists. They're both Shia Islam, both Shia Muslim, um, not states exactly, but groups. And I note that here because they have much more sophisticated rocketry, much more sophisticated kind of everything. Again, they're not an army in the sense that the U.S. Army is, that that the IDF is, but a much more powerful force. And so what's kind of hanging over all of this is, are they going to attack from the north? Because then you have a two-front situation that is, to put it mildly, much more complex, much more dangerous for the Israelis. And there's all sorts of factors that play into that, what could happen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that brings us to another point that I think is important to bear in mind in this. And that is that, in large part because of Lebanon and Hezbollah, the U.S., President Biden, has sent a aircraft carrier group to basically off the coast of Israel and Lebanon. Not doing anything yet, but sending it there. And just today, they announced that they're sending a second carrier group into the Mediterranean. So you've got one that is going to be sort of off the coast, far enough off the coast that they're not, they don't want to get too close because then you can have a stray rocket hit a ship and all stuff like that, but close enough. And then another one in the Mediterranean. So could get there very quickly if it wanted to. So I don't think anybody thinks that the US has any intention of getting involved militarily in any of this. But this is important to know because this is still a major, major show of force. It sort of bucks up the Israelis, say that we're kind of backing them up potentially militarily. But it sends a very clear message to Hezbollah, other Iranian proxies in basically in Syria, and to Iran that if it came to it, the U.S. is already there in force. So if Iran had any idea of kind of having all of its proxies attack at once, opening a second front in the north of Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, the U.S. has a carrier group right there that could get involved immediately. And if it wanted to, it has a second that is going to be very close by and could get involved. Just in case you're not familiar with these terms, what a carrier group is, it's an aircraft carrier, which is the sort of the centerpiece capital ship of the modern U.S. Navy, with a small flotilla of additional ships that travel with it. Those are there for to defend the aircraft carrier, also have attack capacities. They operate as a group, and again, these are kind of the centerpiece of the modern U.S. Navy. This is how the United States projects force with its Navy. So again, this is a big, big show of force, and we should all understand the significance of it and who it's meant to threaten, overawe, who we're kind of sending a signal to. It's about Hezbollah and Iran, basically. So that's another point. The last point, which I will just flag for your attention, and I mentioned this in a post earlier today, is almost since the beginning of when this happened, and we're like 4+ days into this now. There have been reports that Egypt sent Israel some kind of warning that something like this was coming, and that the Israelis basically didn't pay attention or didn't give it the importance, the attention that it merited. And in addition to that, the flavor of these reports are that the Israeli government was focused on the West Bank, and not just focused on the West Bank in general. The current Israeli government is heavily dependent on two extremist parties that are strongly identified with, made up with extremist settlers in the West Bank. And so when they say focus on the West Bank, they don't just mean like, oh, there's some commotion on the West Bank and they're kind of focusing the Israeli military on the West Bank. These extremist settlers go on these kind of like wilding expeditions to adjacent Palestinian villages and towns. And look, both of these sides kind of, there are violent elements on both sides of this in the West Bank, but the current government has a heavy dependence on the Israeli settler side of that stuff. So when they say focused on the West Bank, it means kind of like, getting the Israeli military there to back up, manage, keep an eye on things with their supporters, with the current government supporters in the West Bank. So the idea is they're focused on the West Bank. They kind of like don't bother us about what's going on down in the South. So the accusation here isn't just that they kind of miss something. It goes to the sort of the whole essence of what the current Israeli government is about. Very focused on uh, these extremist groups that have now been welcomed into the current Israeli government and focusing the Israeli military on taking care of those folks as opposed to defending the country. Now, again, that's the sort of the flavor of the accusation. So you have these reports. The prime minister's office, Prime Minister Netanyahu, they denied it. The initial report said that I believe the head of Egyptian intelligence actually contacted Netanyahu directly, said, hey, some coming here, and that this was 10 days out from what proved to be the attacks. It's always hard to know in these cases how specific was it, because flare-ups of violence happen all the time in this part of the world. So just what they were warning about, how much it was distinct from, I'm sure, the kind of warnings they get all the time is a big question. So that was denied. Subsequent to there's been all sorts of reporting back and forth with slightly different versions of events, but it's been very hard for me to make sense of just what to make of it. But today, Chairman McCall, who's the chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, made a statement, and he said, "We know that Egypt gave Israel a warning 3 days out, and we don't know, how they missed it, why they didn't react, blah 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 blah." He also said that he's not clear on what level the warning was at. Again, there's sort of like operational stuff, 5 layers beneath the prime minister, and then there's stuff that there's all sorts of layers, government layers that warnings can be made on. But the key here is this takes it out of just anonymous sources in Egypt and the prime minister's office and different Israeli news outlets saying things. This is now the U.S. government, basically. McCall's a House Republican. He's generally a normal player. He's not some Matt Gaetz, Jim Jordan weirdo. So this is real. This is going to continue to be an issue. And I don't think we know exactly where it's going to go. Look, everybody here has their own interests, their own, no one here is a neutral. Something terrible happened here, and everybody wants to get away from culpability for it. So even though I have no sympathy whatsoever for Netanyahu or his government, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to want to say, "Oh, this didn't just happen on your watch. You're responsible. You fucked up. We warned you, and you didn't do anything." And the Egyptians have their own fish to fry here. It's also true we don't know exactly what kind of warning, but needless to say, in the current climate in Israel, these are explosive charges, as they would be in any country. We had our own version of this after 9/11, with that Bin Laden determined to strike in U.S. presidential daily brief. I don't know, a few months out before the attacks. Even more so, though, and this is the last point, then we're going to get to the speaker's race. I saw a lot of people saying right after this happened, "Oh, this is there's going to be this rally around the flag effect, and this will solve all of Benjamin Netanyahu's problems for him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." That is not what has happened. There has been a tremendous national solidarity rally around the flag effect in Israel, but it has not been around the current government. There is a tremendous amount of anger toward the current government, at least for now, because they let this happen. Not necessarily, that's kind of setting aside this question of did they get a specific warning, stuff like that. This goes to the sort of the very basic essence of what the Israeli state and what Israeli culture is about. The government is supposed to prevent stuff like this from happening. And they didn't, obviously, right? And this comes in a context when the country was already very, very divided about Netanyahu, about this judicial coup plan they've been pushing, about basically handing a lot of the state structure over to these extremist parties, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this comes in a climate where there is a tremendous amount of anger and sense of betrayal towards the current government, and that is obviously in a certain sense muted by that sense of collective solidarity, in the sense that the country is at war, right? They've got things to focus on. I As of about 36 hours ago, they had called up 300,000 reservists. I believe that's been up to 600,000 reservists. So like a significant part of the country has been mobilized as soldiers. A lot's going on there. But keep an eye on this whole issue of this alleged Egyptian heads up and whether it was ignored in whatever sense or another. That's the kind of thing that that's not going to go away. And the fact that McCall said this today suggests that not only that there's something to it, but that the U.S. knows details about it, which takes it out of just something that the Egyptian and Israeli government can kind of fight over about what happened, and so on and so forth like that. So a lot going on there. One thing I want to note here is that this is a topic that we're not going to do a lot of reporting on in our reporting capacity, because it's totally outside of our expertise domain. We're not over there. We don't, our reporting capacity is not designed for these kind of topics. I will continue writing about it and sort of trying to explain at whatever level of generality that I can. But let's move on to what was last week the big sort of emerging news crisis, which was the overthrow of Kevin McCarthy. And this is intersected with the Israel story, because for the moment there's kind of no functioning House of Representatives, and because of that there's no ability to be to pass any legislation or to pass like an aid package for Israel. I don't think Israel really needs much of an aid package, certainly in the short run. The IDF's a pretty powerful army. They don't have a big shortage of money. But in any case, that it's obviously the two things have kind of intersected. Just today, the House GOP caucus had its caucus meeting to elect a new speaker, asterisk. Normally, the caucus gets together and decides who their nominee for speaker is. Then you go to the floor. Every member of the caucus votes for that person's speaker, right? That's how it works. But obviously, that's not how the Republican caucus works. Steve Scalise defeated Jim Jordan. I believe it was 113 to 99. And so, again, by the normal way things operate, that means Steve Scalise is the next speaker. But we're still not quite sure if he's gonna if all of them are going to back him. There was an effort to bring this all to the floor today, kind of like, let's just vote on it before anybody gets weird, right? And that seems to have already been knocked down. Enough members of the caucus have come forward to say, dude, we're not doing this today, so drop that. And that's where we are. And I don't think we know quite what's going to happen. Just out of my as I'm talking here, I noticed that one of our colleagues dropped in a statement from George Santos, basically saying, I'll vote for Steve Scalise if you guarantee me I cannot be expelled. So that's his price. And I guess there's at least already 3 other members who said they won't vote for Scalise. So that's 4 if you include Santos. So it's already getting rough. So Kate Riga, are we going to have a speaker this week?
Honestly, I if I had had to put money on it last week, I would have said no. Um, things are so fluid and weird right now. I mean, I think we would have guessed that Scalise would have won the kind of closed door nomination hearing. Now the question is, at the beginning of this closed door meeting, they were debating voting on a rule that would have said the nomination only goes to the person who can get the same number of votes that they're going to need to win on the House floor. The idea being lock it down, like you say, kind of grease the skids so you go from this meeting room to the House floor and there are no surprises. They voted, mostly this effort led by Scalise's people, to table that motion. So Scalise only won with the majority of the Republican caucus, not the majority of the House. Um, so obviously, the difference between those two numbers is pretty important, considering that now, like you said, we have a cluster of always Jims who say, at least now, they're not going to vote for Scalise. You have Marjorie Taylor Greene kind of saying the quiet part out loud and saying Scalise has a serious form of cancer and that she doesn't want to vote for him. She's also a Jordan person. And then you had this handful who were like, it's ridiculous that we might go to the full house, 2 minutes after we got out of the room. So those people seem, kind of easiest to sway upon first glance, because if the way to kind of ameliorate them is just to say, okay, we'll vote tomorrow, then you kind of got that taken care of. But
Although I would say though, I kind of read that as give us a you need to give us a little time to decide if we're going to make trouble.
right. And I think that's what a lot of the always gyms are doing as well, kind of keeping themselves in the main character barrel. Like they want reporters to be focused on them as the potential holdouts. They might be kind of crafting some kind of concessions behind the scenes, or as you say with George Santos, very much in front of the scenes. So, you know, I think we were of the mind that Scalise had the pretty clear advantage just in terms of, the whip operation, the fact that he's in leadership, he knows a lot of members, et cetera, et cetera. That's still true. Whether he's got the votes right now to win on the House floor, totally, totally unclear. Might not come clear until we actually get to the House vote, because House Republicans, unlike House Democrats, don't I just have a much weaker motivation to kind of not make the party look foolish. That's just not really what drives them. A lot of these people define themselves in opposition to party leadership and to the quote unquote establishment. So, being the rebel, being the Matt Gaetz, like that appeals to a sizable number. And it doesn't even have to be a sizable number when your majorities are this slim. So now we've got the Scalise people kind of whipping behind the scenes, trying to see if they can win over these people. And a lot of these people are the usual suspects in terms of like, what do you want, man? It's not like these are generally kind of very policy minded, wonkish, like, I just want to get my pet legislation onto the floor. No, it's like these are Nancy Macian people who want to be in front of TV cameras and want to do a hit on CNN later tonight and then maybe go over to Alex Jones. And, that's who he's working with, because that's who the party has emboldened and empowered. So, yeah, we're in this like weird fluid place where Scalise won the nomination, yay for Scalise. Jordan is not going to fight it. He said that he would introduce Scalise on the House floor.
Oh, he did.
Um,
I hadn't seen that. I hadn't seen him officially say that. So that's at least an inch. Okay, so he's
yeah. So
makes
maybe
sense for
that
him. Yeah.
that might bring over the always gyms. You know, we'll see if Jordan also kind of gets some kind of consolation prize out of this, because with Scalise moving up in the pecking order, then you've got his old job of majority leader open, even though we already know there are a few people interested there. You know, the reshuffling of leadership creates potentially new opportunities, though Jordan might kind of feel satisfied with his big committee post. But yeah, so that's where we are right now. And then it's also been funny because in the last few days, you've got just some hilarious jockeying from Kevin McCarthy, where he's been doing this kind of dance of like, yeah, you know, like people who might run for president doing that thing of like, well, who can ever know what the future will hold? You know, he's doing that kind of hinting that maybe he wants people to like come beg him to serve again, as if he's like this indispensable legislative mind that they can't live without, and kind of keeping the door open to him potentially jumping into the race, or like withholding the support of his people. And we kind of touched last episode on the fact that there's some bad blood between Scalise and McCarthy. So that is probably playing in a little bit, the sheer pettiness of McCarthy saying he's not going to kind of throw his weight behind his deputy man and, you know, make his path any easier. So that's where things are right now. It's messy. Um, and you do it's funny because there's this like tendency to make everything very serious, I think. And there was some like chattering about how this House resolution kind of saying that you're standing in solidarity with Israel, like it can't pass the House because we don't have a speaker. And it's like, obviously, the situation in Israel is really serious. Passing a House resolution, which is little more than like someone typed up these few paragraphs and the House passed it, you know, that they're standing in solidarity, I don't think is like the going to be the big legislative lockjam of our time. But as you say, the House can't function. Doesn't really matter. They don't do that much either, but the next shutdown coming close. So there is like some amount of speed, but I think for House Republicans right now, it's coming down more to, do you want to risk another 15 rounder, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there were two in the piece you published an hour or so ago. There was what, Lauren Boebert. Who was the other one?
Oh,
There
Max
was
Miller.
okay, Max Miller, who I don't, it's hard to keep track of these guys, but with I think we see with someone like Boebert, you know, this is I don't even wait. Did she actually vote to unseat McCarthy?
Mm-mm.
She didn't, did she? Okay,
Which was a
so
kind of a surprise. Like there was
right,
murmuring in the chamber when she voted.
right. So with people like her, I don't know what I think. You never want to be too cynical, but with someone like her, this is kind of like wait. There's an opportunity. We're not going to let an opportunity for a lot more Fox hits and a lot more avails to go down the tubes. We're just getting started here.
Hmm.
I still have to live down the Beetlejuice situation. So why are we done here? There is that kind of when you normally have a caucus vote. Okay, we've decided as a caucus it's Scalise. We're going to go down there and I'll vote for Scalise even if he wasn't our first choice. That's not exciting for the backbench members of the party. There's no drama. You just go and vote like you're supposed to vote. That's being part of a political party. So and to the extent that there is such a thing, Scalise is more of a right winger than McCarthy was, although it's hard to say what operative meaning that had since McCarthy's calling card was to do everything those folks wanted to make sure he could be speaker. So this isn't the only thing that conceivably here was an issue of I wouldn't even call it an issue of substance. It was an issue that was concrete, was whether you would change these rules for how many people you need to do a motion to vacate, to change the rule that unseated McCarthy. Now, whether or not that, they talked about, oh, we're going to make it from 1 to 5, whatever, these things kind of don't matter, because having one person to, kind of pull that trigger, that doesn't mean you're going to win the vote, right? But they've got this very close margin, and he did that, and even people who didn't want him to do it ended up voting to support it and unseated McCarthy, right? So there's just some element of this caucus that just doesn't want this to be done, doesn't want to go back to what counted as normal until a few weeks ago. And as Kate made clear, we're now about a month out from the next shutdown cliff. And just play that out in your head. If this is Steve Scalise, there was actually a kind of a telling moment at the town hall that they had. I mean, call it a town hall, a kind of a caucus town hall that they had yesterday to kind of each to have Scalise and Jordan make their case, and both of them basically were forced to say, like, yeah, we're going to do another CR. Because what else are we going to do? We don't have that. We haven't done any appropriation stuff. And I think what is it? Jordan said he'd do like a 1% cut. But this is just going to keep going on, and forever, indefinitely.
Yeah, I mean, that's the piece that's kind of more interesting to me than who the baton passes to, is the motion to vacate question, because I don't think this will happen, because I think Scalise has already said he's fine keeping the rule. But you could see now that Scalise is the presumptive next speaker, him saying, by the way, we got to change the motion to vacate, because why in the world would you take the job otherwise? I mean, this ensures that his tenure is going to be about the same duration as McCarthy's, because you can be as David Duke sans baggage as you want. Like, you have to pass certain bills periodically every few months. You have no choice. And so maybe you could argue that Scalise is further right than McCarthy, and he would have allowed the government to shut down. Okay, and then what? And leave it shut down until the next election? I mean, does that seem electorally savvy for Republicans? So it's just, it doesn't matter that they're further right than McCarthy, because the problem that hounded him is the same problem that hounded Paul Ryan and John Boehner. It's this far right entity that just doesn't want to govern. That's only sole motivation is breaking the government. And that's going to come to a head again, obviously, in November. And then again, when we, pretty soon we're going to start talking about the teeth in the debt ceiling bill, the part where we get to the end of the year, and we're going to have to start thinking about the measures that they put into that law to prevent the endless stream of CRs and to kind of force the government to be properly, fully funded at some point. And those cuts are draconian, and they kind of also pinpoint with target precision the only government entities that Republicans ever care about, the Defense Department type thing. So whoever becomes speaker is in an impossible situation if the motion to vacate remains at any threshold where these like 8 to 10 people can kind of take the wheels off the wagon. And there was some kind of heated debate about this a few days ago, where some House Republicans were saying we should make it a majority vote to spark the motion, or something that would give them a little bit of insulation the next time that Matt Gaetz decides he hasn't been in headlines enough lately. But it hasn't come up at all in recent years, or in recent days. As far as I know, Scalise is not at all planning to make it a condition of his speakership, which you can see why, because that'll also imperil a handful of votes that he needs to win. So it's looking, and we're tracking this closely, but it's looking like if we barrel into the speakership, if Scalise picks it, gets through, no matter how many rounds it takes him, if motion to vacate is the same, hey, his fate is written in stone, as is the guy who comes after him, as is anyone who ever serves as the speaker for House Republicans.
Yeah, and one for our listeners. One point to keep in mind here is that there's the motion to vacate, but what makes the motion to vacate a big deal is that they've got such a tiny majority. You have a 20-30 vote majority. This ceases to be that big an issue because that's just a lot more cushion. So in some ways, it's the narrowness of the majority that is the kind of the puddle of gasoline they're sitting in. The motion to vacate just makes it a little easier to light a match, right? But I mean, they're always on on kind of shaky ground. One thing to again, we're so far afield for any kind of orderly process of government. But one thing to keep in mind is this situation in Israel, this is not going to be done in a few days. This is going to go on for some time. Um, I have, and again, this is just speculation, but I've been trying to think about historical analogs. I think the historical analog is the siege of Beirut in, I don't remember, it was 1981 or 1982. Basically, the PLO had set up shop in Lebanon, and the whole point of that invasion of Lebanon, which set set the stage for so much that has come since then, is to expel the PLO from Lebanon, which they eventually did. And that went on for a while. And Gaza is a very small area of territory. In any case, the point is, this is going to be going on for a while. It's certainly going to be going on by the time Thanksgiving rolls around, which is at least the recess for Thanksgiving, I believe, is November 17th, which is when the next government shutdown cliff is. So one thing that is going to play into this is that the bad optics of trying to shut the government down are significantly higher when you've got an international crisis going on. That's obvious, especially when, again, as I said, I don't think anybody has any thought that the US has any plans to or any high likelihood that the US is going to be involved in this militarily. But we are making a pretty big show of force in that area. And when that's happening, the idea that you're going to shut down the federal government or even have one house of Congress just not functioning, that just seems like a bigger deal than it normally would. So all of these things are going to be colliding over the next few weeks, and that's where we are with that.
And an interesting thing to keep an eye on there is going to be when there is an effort to, give Israel aid. We're already seeing some stirrings of kind of tying it to Ukraine aid, a way to kind of force this sect of House Republicans that have decided to kind of abandon Ukraine to follow through. And that'll be interesting because if that's in the hands of a new speaker who's sitting under the sword of Damocles motion to vacate, I mean, what do? Do you kind of give in to the small group of House Republicans that don't want to help Ukraine anymore? Do you maybe decouple it and endanger its passage in the Senate? So, I mean, that's going to be, I think, a specifically kind of concrete thing that's coming up. And one more thing I wanted to say on the motion to vacate is that we discussed this briefly last episode, but the idea that when Paul Ryan was being forced into the speakership, a job that he did not want, and that, they kind of came on their hands and knees asking if he would do the job. And he was initially saying, I'll take it if we change the motion to vacate. I don't want to be, dumped on my ass 2 minutes after I'm agreeing to do this for you. Even then, when he didn't really want the gavel, he still backed off that request, bowing to then the Mark Meadows is the right of the House Republicans who why would they give up that power? Most people in the House are relatively powerless, and especially this kind of crop that's being the troublemakers this time around, they're basically all like freshmen or sophomores. They don't have positions of prominence. This like gives them huge sway over party leadership. So, just something to keep in mind, that I think it's very clear that the next speaker's success will be tied to whether there is a motion to vacate or not. And it seems really pretty impossible to me for Scalise or whoever it is to kind of make that a condition of the speakership and still manage to get, the 217 votes.
Yeah, I don't even think, as you suggested, I don't think they're even going to try. There's sort of no point. So tell us about these oral arguments. What's the story here?
So this was the first redistricting case of the term. It came out of South Carolina. The parameters are basically this, which is after the 2020 census, South Carolina had to even out the population in its various congressional districts. Namely, the first congressional district had gotten way too big, and the sixth congressional district had gotten much too small. The sixth one is where Jim Clyburn has held for, since 1993. District 1 is currently Nancy Mace's district, held by a Republican for a long time, flipped by Joe Cunningham in like a kind of a huge upset. And then Mace won it back narrowly, and then redistricting shenanigans, and all of a sudden it's a super safe seat. But so what they did to deal with this, evening out of the population, is one would think you would just take voters from your overstuffed first congressional district, shift them into the pretty empty sixth congressional district, and be done with it. What they did is they moved all these Republican leaning areas from the sixth district into the first district, and then plucked out Black voters from the first district to transport them back to the sixth district with such precision to make sure that the Black voting age population in District 1 stayed at 17%, which they've determined if it's 17% or less, that's pretty safe for Republicans. If you get from 17 to 20% Black voters, toss up territory. And if you're 20% or higher, that district is going to go to a Democrat. So this precision kind of moving Republicans in, plucking Black voters out, and putting them back in the other district. That's what's at the Supreme Court this morning. Now the catch is, and what made these Supreme Court oral arguments the most bizarre, through the looking glass thing I've ever witnessed, is as of 2019, the Supreme Court said that federal courts can no longer hear partisan gerrymandering cases, that those are beyond the reach of the courts because they have political aspects to them, blah, blah, blah. So the only thing that federal courts can hear are racial gerrymandering cases now. State courts can still hear partisan ones. So South Carolina came into these arguments saying, oh yeah, obviously we were gerrymandering. Totally, man. Like, we're Republicans. We want as many districts as possible to be safe Republican seats. We did this. We exported Democratic voters out of this district on purpose. We did not want a Democrat to ever win it again. And that's what we did. So you've got the justices and the attorneys on both sides being totally candid that the South Carolinian lawmakers are distorting democracy completely, like choosing their voters, making it virtually impossible for them to lose more than one of the congressional delegation seats to a Democrat. But they just have to say, no, nothing about race. Absolutely has nothing to do with race whatsoever. This is just about partisan lean, which adds another kind of farcical layer to this whole thing, because especially in the South, race and partisan lean are pretty inextricably connected. So you've got one side saying this is about party, one side saying this is about race, when the reality is we're mostly talking about Black Democrats and white Republicans. So go
And
ahead.
just so I understand, and the reason for that is that the court has said, if you can say it's politics, or it's partisan politics as opposed to race, we shouldn't even be here. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that's just that means you're done in the federal courts. I mean, obviously these two are never going to be really fully divisible. But that's why they're basically so openly saying, yes, our goal here was to remove enough Democrats so Nancy Mace has a safe seat,
Exactly.
because if they can prove that, then the discussion's over.
Right. And how do you prove it either way when those Democrats are mostly black people, right? So like it was just you had Samuel Alito kind of just like going after the individual experts who had testified before the district federal court panel, which is also not the Supreme Court's mandate here. Like redistricting cases, I won't get into it and make our listeners want to like kill themselves, but it's a really unique setup in the court system, whereas it goes from a panel of 3 federal judges with direct review to the Supreme Court. That's how redistricting cases work. And so what the Supreme Court is supposed to be doing right now is deciding whether the district panel, which found against the state legislators, which found that it was a pretty precision, clear racial gerrymander, finding whether they made a quote unquote clear error in their decision. That by that standard, the appellate court is supposed to give great deference to the district court. They're not supposed to kind of like go back through the trial record and being like, I don't know if this was like factually correct. They're just looking for a really clear error. And it's written into the standard that just because the Supreme Court might have decided this differently, that's not enough for them to overturn the district panel. If the only standard is if the district panel arrived at a quote unquote plausible conclusion based on the record before them, the Supreme Court is supposed to say, okay, that's like none of our business. We're not supposed to be kind of micromanaging the lower courts. But it was really clear today that that's not
They'll
what they're
make an
going to
exception.
do. Exactly. I mean, you had Roberts was aggressive going after the kind of voter side today. You had basically all the conservatives vocally and plainly in support of the South Carolina lawmakers, which is going to leave us in a place where, oh, you want to do partisan gerrymandering? Go with God. Federal courts are not going to care. And now, if you're in a situation where, oopsie daisy, a lot of overlap between race and partisan leaning, good luck proving a racial gerrymander, because if black people are also Democrats, then I guess southern states win. That's like the assumption we're going into.
So let me ask you, because what you're talking about for our listeners is an elementary aspect of what appellate courts are. The idea is that when you have a trial or a hearing in a trial court, and then you appeal questions of law, not questions of fact. And as Kate says, there are legal principles that allow you to kind of, look under that cover if things are just crazy. If an absurd finding of fact is made. But again, this is what appellate courts are. You review questions of law, not findings of fact. And so that's what we're talking about here. The findings about, is it a racial gerrymander or not, were done at the I guess at the trial court level. So in the oral arguments, were the conservatives basically, did it look like they were going to try to say, well, this is they, in fact they made an implausible finding of fact, and that's going to be our road? Or were they just kind of saying, the new under the new principle of whatever we want to do, we're going to do whatever we want to do? Did they signal there what
I
this
think
what
they're going to cloak it under the first, because I mean, they were doing like, this is the kind of situation where a lot of it relies on experts, right? Because you need someone who is an expert in, map drawing or kind of understanding these granular population level things to say, okay, well, it was much, much more likely that you would get booted out of the first district if you were a black Democrat than a white Democrat, right? And like these various precincts that have over 1,000 black voters, they all got exported, right? Like, so you had the conservatives kind of picking at the various experts, debating whether the district court had properly weighted them, saying that the plaintiff should have come up with an alternative map themselves, which is not a requirement in these cases and would be kind of an insurmountable burden for the plaintiffs. So it's pretty clear that they're going to go back and say the district court was wrong. They and they're gonna get persnickety. They're gonna say like they gave this one guy, too much credence, and this guy's been doing this job for 20 years. So what could you possibly have to say against him? Alito went on this whole rant about how people are being like too mean to the cartographer who had worked with the legislator for a long time. So, it's pretty clear. I would put my money on a 6-3 in favor of South Carolina here. And it's just like it's this is the Roberts Court legacy, right? Is like greenlighting a total distortion of democracy, in particular, the old Confederacy, just greenlighting all of that there and taking away all the reform sense that are meant to kind of keep these racist and anti-democratic, machinations in check. They've ripped all that up. And now we're just at this stage where it's kind of like, good job, South Carolina. Your partisan gerrymander, that's okay on our watch. So go with God.
It strikes me that again, the basic principle that appellate courts don't make independent findings of fact is pretty foundational. I mean, it's not unprecedented because as we said, the law has paths available, wherein an appellate court can say your finding of facts simply doesn't meet any test of rationality. This makes no sense. So we're going to kind of overturn it on those grounds. But that's pretty clearly not what you have here. This is I don't. It's really impossible not to say, at a minimum, that there are reasonable arguments on both sides of this, and so that is kind of that's the part. I mean, we know what the Roberts Court is about when it comes to the Voting Rights Act, notwithstanding the recent case. Was that in Alabama or Mississippi? I'm spacing.
Alabama. Yeah.
Alabama. So I thought, okay, in Alabama, but this just shows that it's a results oriented jurisprudence. It's clear where you want to go, and you're gonna go where you want to go, and that's
Yeah.
just it.
And let this serve as a damper for anyone who did that dumbass like post Alabama. Well, look at John Roberts being the like responsible centrist. Like, oh, please. The Alabama decision was a welcome surprise for sure, but this is John Roberts, like his own personal number one handiwork. Like, obviously, his court will be known for the abortion first and foremost, but the crusade against voting rights, that's his thing. That's what he's brought. And that's the direction that he has steered this court, even pre, getting like all the kind of Trumpian judges on it. So,
Yeah.
this is who he is. This is the kind of case he loves. And the shredding of voting rights across the country is his biggest legacy.
Yeah. I mean, I'll just say a different flavor of the same thing, that they could have upheld this lower court case and still had their principle in effect. It really wouldn't have lost them much. And the reality is that in the nature of things, the federal judiciary in the South is pretty Republican leaning, because you defer to the Senate, all that kind of stuff. There's the federal judiciary broadly maps the regional political contours of the country. So you could have let this one go, let Nancy take a bit of a hit, Nancy Mace, and still had your principle. But when you've got 6 justices, you don't have to make compromises.
And this is fundamentally and inextricably connected to the 2024 elections. Like, there's a reason that kind of all these right-wing judges are going full right-wing judge with these redistricting cases. And it's because a lot of them, Alabama, South Carolina, we've got one in Tennessee, we've got one in Louisiana. If the kind of voting reform minded side was upheld, these would probably result in extra Democratic seats in these states. And like maybe you're only getting one out of Georgia and one out of Louisiana. But when you kind of combine all the active cases together, that's 5 or 6 seats. And we're right now, what the majority is like 7 or 8, depending on absences. So, I mean, that's the ball game, right? So there's a reason why right wing litigants are going hard after this stuff, and that these right wing judges, kind of long building comfort with just saying like, no, kind of fuck the black voters, is really coming to a head right at this moment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, for it's 7 or 8, but it always depends on how you want to think of it, because it's 7 or 8, but you move 4 and then you change then you change the majority. So even a literal handful of these races could turn control of the House. And then you have this other a very different context of redistricting that is now going to come to pass in the state of New York, and the GOP could easily lose 3 or 4 seats just with that redistricting. So I think it's funny at this point. Both. Well, I'm not sure the Senate's too close to call, unfortunately, but I think there's kind of a consensus that if you were betting, you'd bet for the Democrats to take back the House next year and to lose the Senate. It's conceivable they could lose the Senate by a significant margin. I mean, there's so many tough races for the Democrats. Democrats could have a win the presidency, win back the House, and lose the Senate by 2 or 3 seats, just because of the seats that are up in 2024. But there you go.
And on that cheerful note,
yeah. Well, we couldn't have everything be the cheeriness of the Hamas Israel Hamas war
God.
in the Eastern Mediterranean, but there you go. I guess at a minimum, it seems. Let's have a bet. Let's have a gentle person's bet here. Do we have a speaker by the next episode of the podcast?
I say yes.
I say yes too, which
Oh,
takes a
that's
lot of the drama.
unfun.
Yeah, I know. Well, you got to go first. That's no fair. But no, I feel like the national security Israel stuff kind of looming now. I there was kind of before that I felt like there was kind of a sense of like maybe they'll just let this, because once you decide, like a handful of people are like, let's not go too fast here. Hold up here. At at what point it's not like a debt ceiling or a government shutdown where you say like, all right, this is going to close and this is all this kind of stuff. Why not just kick it a few more days? A few more hits for me on Hannity.
Right.
a few more press avails outside the Capitol building. Like, what's the big deal? Like, we're
Right.
not shutting the government down again until mid-November, and like, this is fun. We weren't passing any legislation as it is. So anyway, that's well, we'll see. You can bet against Kate and I. Maybe we won't have a speaker.
Yeah.
Any
And quick little plug
Yep.
just from our second show that we are starting to roll out, and we're recording episodes to continue to put out in the Josh Marshall podcast feed. That's called Belaboring the Point, with me, rotating TPM staff members, and outside experts. Our first one was on Ukraine. Second one dropping soon, more in the works. So check that out if your podcast thirst is insatiable.
Yeah, well, and if we have, as always, if we have any breaking news before last Wednesday, we may come in for a quick episode of the signature podcast here. But more podcast goodness coming one way or another. And I guess that's it for this week.
All right. See you next week.
See ya.
The Josh Marshall podcast is hosted by me, TPM reporter Kate Riga, and TPM founder, editor-in-chief Josh Marshall. The show is produced by Jackie Wilhelm. Thanks to Why Not Jansfeld for our podcast theme song, and thanks to all our TPM members who make this possible. Rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and subscribe wherever you listen.